Dear students and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am Andreas Walser and I'm the director of the Zurich Center for the Study of the Ancient World. It is my immense pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Mary Beard. None of you has come to this lecture to hear me speak, so I will keep my introduction very short. It would be a commonplace to say that Mary Beard actually needs no introduction, but it is nonetheless true. Already 15 years ago, she has been described as Britain's best-known classicist, and today we can safely drop Britain and simply call her the best-known living classicist. She owes this position to her outstanding academic work, her wide-ranging efforts to make the ancient world accessible to a wider audience, and to her critical engagement as a public intellectual. Mary Beard studied classics at Cambridge University, where she also received her PhD in classics. From 1979 to 1983, she was a lecturer in classics at King's College in London before she returned as a fellow to Newham College in Cambridge and became the only female lecturer in classics at the time. Mary Beard was named Professor of Classics at Cambridge in 2004 and remained in this position until her retirement, I think, in this year. I will not even try to describe her wide-ranging contributions to the history and culture of the ancient world, and more specifically on the history of Rome. One could start with her early studies on the late Republic or her numerous contributions on the religions of Rome. But one has to name her more recent and most successful books on the Roman triumph, on Pompeii, on laughter in ancient Rome, her history of ancient Rome, and most recently her book on the 12 Caesars, Images of Power from the Ancient World to the Modern. I could go on and on. In all these books, Mary provides new insights with scholarly rigor while still remaining accessible also for non-specialist readers. Probably more than any other classical scholar today, Mary Beard made efforts to make the ancient world accessible to a broader public beyond the university, while at the same time showing its relevance for today's debates. Again, her activities are far too many to list here, from her role as a classics editor for the Times Literary Supplement, now for 30 years, to numerous articles in newspapers and magazines. In the last 15 years, she has made a large number of highly acclaimed TV documentaries and hosted her own shows on TV. Mary Beard's has become kind of its own brand for the BBC. Before I will really stop, I have to mention her wonderful blog, Dawn's Life, and her presence on Twitter, where she has, when I last checked, 325,065 followers. I do not know if Elon Musk is one of them. As you can imagine, Mary Beard's work and activities have been honored with many different awards and distinctions. She has been made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire for services to the study of classical civilizations. She holds honorary degrees from several universities, is a fellow of the British Academy, and received various prizes for her books. Mary Beard has never been shy to tackle challenging questions, both in her scholarly work but also in public debates that go far beyond academia. It is a difficult question, too, that she will take up this evening. Does classics have a future? I could not think of someone more suitable to discuss this question that obviously could not be more important to me and to many of us here in this room. I truly hope that the answer is not a simple no. That would be a short lecture. But I'm sure it won't be. Dear Mary, we are extremely happy to have you here, and we are very eager to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. And I was delighted that you chose the image for the poster for this lecture from the cover of one of my books, because more than a decade ago, I gave a lecture at the New York Public Library, which became the first chapter of that book. And the lecture had the same title that this lecture does, which is Does Classics Have a Future? And in a way, the lecture tonight is trying to rethink that. Does the answer to the question, does classics have a future, does it look different now from how it looked 10 or 11 years ago? Why does it look different, if it does? And what kind of answer would make a good answer to that question? I'm going to be focusing on classics, but I've got wider issues in mind beyond classics, which comes down to how we write about and how we live with the history of our own academic subjects, whether it's classics or archaeology or history or literature or whatever. And I think that's an important question, because I can't help feeling sometimes that people, this is now to take a classical example, the people who are extremely sophisticated at looking at the history and the literature of the ancient past are not always so sophisticated at analysing the more recent history of their own discipline. In fact, sometimes they're very bad at doing the history of their own subject. And that's what I want to try and expose a bit this evening. Now, a decade ago, I was facing the question of why should or why would classics survive? Classics, broadly defined in a quite characteristically British way as that amalgam of the study of literature, culture, history, languages and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome and their adjacent territories. What was the future of that subject? Now, in some ways, back then the picture seemed reasonably clear. Fewer and fewer students were studying Latin and Greek at high school. In the UK, currently, fewer than 300 students now take Greek, ancient Greek, as part of their school leaving exam at age 18. So one question was, were there actually the people to give classics a future? Now, a firm no is one but not very interesting answer, I think. Nonetheless, there were people back then, and I'm going to make this a bit more complicated in a minute, who did say there is no future in this subject. And the reasons for there being no future were fairly obvious ones. Classics had become probably a kind of accidental victim of its own past, right? It was been a very male subject, a rather a very elitist subject, an imperialist subject that had had its day and really had lost its way. I think there were quite a lot of people then, and it looks a bit different now, but I shall come to that in a minute. Quite a lot of people then who would have said, we don't actually know what the point of this subject is any longer. And some of the blame back then went to what professional classicists, largely in universities, were doing. For people of my generation, a book called Who Killed Homer by V.D. Hansen and John Heath was a polarizing intervention in 1998. Their view was that it was because classicists in universities had taken refuge in theory and also, if they were lucky, in long terms of sabbatical research leave, that they'd sort of lost any contact with the public debate. They'd ceased to go out there and enthuse people with the excitement of studying the ancient world and why it was interesting. You know, they were too much interested in their own flirtation with post-structuralism or whatever. Now, on the other side, of course, there were people who argued, and I was one of them really, that it was partly because academics in ancient studies had not engaged with theory that they had become marginalized from major current intellectual debates. So what I tried to do back then, this is all a decade ago, was to try to kind of cut through some of those relatively common arguments. And I underlined two things. First, that classics is and was a subject that is founded on nostalgia, founded on the principle that people before us were always better at it than we are. And I quoted then one lament on the state of the discipline, which went like this, and I put the text on the screen. On many sides, we hear confident assertions that the work of Greek and Latin is done, that their day is past. If the extinction of these languages as potent instruments of education is a sacrifice inexorably demanded by the advancement of civilization, regrets are idle, and we must bow to necessity and give up. Now, that lament, as you might have sensed from the kind of slight tinge of the language, that lament about the death of classics was written in the UK in 1902. At the very moment when we, if we look back, think that classics was at its most self-confident height, right? Yet, characteristically, just like now, the people back then were convinced the subject did not have a future. Even earlier, Thomas Jefferson had observed, although perhaps he was trying to make a point about the superiority of New America over Old Europe, he observed that in Europe, the learning of Latin and Greek is going into disuse. Right? It's the 18th century. Now, in a way, the very definition of classics is one of recapturing what we are always think we risk losing. Right? And I think that even the scholars of the Renaissance, who we sometimes like to think were celebrating, as the word says, the rebirth of classical antiquity, many of them were actually desperately trying to save classical antiquity from what they thought was oblivion. So back then I was claiming that we had to face up to a subject that, unlike, for example, physics, partly defined itself as always being in decline, always about to fail. And in a way, actually sort of kept itself going by thinking that it needed to be rescued all the time. So I think there is a nostalgia absolutely built in. I think that nostalgia has been there since about 200 AD, probably. I think that always the previous generation have got it okay, and we are in risk of losing it. So one has to be a bit careful about believing this kind of lamentation. But I also wanted to say back then that classics did have a particular role as part of the inheritance of Western culture, which I'm putting in inverted commas. Now, let me be absolutely clear. I do not think for a minute that Western civilization, or perhaps better, Western civilizations, plural, is or are, in any simple sense, the direct descendant of Greco-Roman culture or cultures. I am delighted, thank heavens, that Western civilizations have a far more diverse ancestry than Greece and Rome. And for what it's worth, I do not think that the relatively recent construct of the kind of ideal of Western civilization, I don't think that that should be judged superior to any other civilizations. What I do think is that the Greco-Roman inheritance is so intricately embedded within Western culture that it cannot be got rid of without throwing a lot else away that we don't want to throw away. As I said a decade ago, Dante makes less sense without Virgil. John Stuart Mill hardly makes any sense at all without Plato. Titian is completely rootless without Ovid. And Donna Tartt, and I was thinking then about her novel The Secret History, is utterly incomprehensible without Euripides. So I was actually confident, I said, that most people really did want to continue our conversation with the ancient world. There weren't people out there really who wanted to stop thinking about antiquity. And although the number of school kids learning ancient languages was certainly important and certainly a cause for concern maybe, that was not the only way of judging the health of a discipline, which you could see in the popularity of museum exhibitions, television programs about the ancient world, Asterix the Gaul, or novels set in antiquity. So uncharacteristically, I think, for a classicist, I was being optimistic back then and saying, yes, classics did have a future. You know, this was, I was doing this very shortly after the movie Gladiator, came out, and my goodness, there was the ancient world flourishing. Now, I'm still optimistic, but a decade on, the question looks very different. And while some of the arguments that you'd make are the same, some are of an entirely different kind. In particular, from within the field, classics itself, as traditionally practiced, has come to be defined by some as the enemy. Now, I think just over a decade ago, classicists within the field were defending it. They thought of themselves as, being on the barricades to defend the subject they practiced. Now, the strongest critiques of the study of the ancient world as broadly defined as classics, the strongest critiques come from within the discipline itself. Now, I'm going to use a medical metaphor, but I think it sort of sums it up, really. I think a decade ago, classics was looked upon rather like a quite elderly person, patient dying in a hospital for whom we felt a bit sorry. We recognised that the patient had made some bad lifestyle choices, He had smoked and he'd not taken enough exercise, but his end wasn't really his fault. And that was a bit like classics, right? It hadn't helped itself. It had made some bad lifestyle choices too. It hadn't helped itself by being a bit exclusive, a bit male, but its death wasn't really its fault. It was sort of dying of old age. Now, that view has, I think, in significant ways been overturned. Many classicists, as I said, many classicists themselves, and it is classicists themselves, and I don't think we ought to kid ourselves that outside the subject, or at least outside the academy, there are very many people interested out there in our navel-gazing about our subject. The classicists themselves now argue that this patient was actively responsible for its own death. And more than that, it's not that classics is going to die, but it deserves to die. Right? Why? Because it has been actively complicit in, and you can all, I think, name them, far-right politics, white supremacy, misogyny, racism, imperialism, and social exclusion. It has been an intellectual weapon of oppression, and in its own professional work has refused to listen to divergent voices, particularly, but not only, those of people of colour, whom the discipline still excludes. Now, this is just one example of that, one expression of that, from quite a prominent voice in the field. Is there any hope for classics? Can we save the soul and future of a discipline that has historically been implicated in fascism and colonialism, one that continues to be enmeshed in white supremacy and misogyny, in the face of declining enrolments, the student debt crisis, and the increasing precarity of the academic labour force? And even if we do somehow figure out how to save it, will we be studying classics in boats because all of our coastal cities are underwater? There is ample reason to despair. Right? That's a professional classicist speaking. I will tell you who it is if you come up to me in private afterwards, right? It's a female. Now, to be fair to the author, she does go on to say that she thinks that there is a future, actually, there is a future for classics, but only with a major transformation, a complete reinvention of itself, which would involve, among other things, expanding the field of classics beyond the Mediterranean heartland, further east and further south. And that, of course, is where the cries of "burn it all down" come in, that in order to survive, classics as we know it has to be destroyed. The same author explains, burn it all down isn't always a genuine recommendation. Sometimes it's just an expression of extreme frustration, recognition that something, that's classics in this case, is so deeply flawed that gradual, incremental change within existing infrastructure just won't cut it. Now, I think that some or many of those arguments will be familiar to those of you within the field. I think there are different emphases and different nuances in different countries and different intellectual traditions, but I suspect, and I think I can tell from your reactions, that you've recognised in part the position that I have described. And it's not just in classics, of course. We find similar debates about burning it all down, exclusion, complicity in white supremacy, etc., in medieval studies and any number of related disciplines. Now, let me be clear. I think that that kind of questioning is good. Right? If I and you who are in this discipline, if we were living in a discipline that wasn't a bit dissatisfied, very dissatisfied, we'd be living in a discipline that certainly would die. You know, as soon as a discipline starts not to question itself, you know that its days are numbered. And I have a lot of sympathy with some, maybe even many, of the critiques that are commonly made. I have no doubt, for example, that classics has not adequately addressed the whiteness of its practitioners, nor when it does try to address that, does it really know what to do about it? It's particularly difficult, I think, because problems like the demographic of a whole subject can't often be addressed from the top down. The problems of diversity within this subject don't just come down to hiring decisions at universities or whose papers get accepted for publication in prestigious journals. It'd be relatively easy to fix if that was what the problem was. What we're dealing with is a whole lot more complicated issues about what educational opportunities are open to all kids, from the age of 3, right? About how and why students choose to study classics or history or whatever, and how we might make a difference to that. And that's harder and much more expensive to grapple with than just a few hiring decisions at a university or accepting different papers for journals. And I shall be returning at the end to the question of whether changing the focus of classics, what it is seen to be about, would make it more attractive to a wider and more diverse range of students. I also recognise the way that the far right have used and misused the classical world in support of their own agendas. And I am particularly concerned here by the sort of circularity of this. The more classicists go on about how they've been conscripted by the far right, the more the far right conscript them, right? But they have, in a sense, and I think this is well known, the alt-right, the far right, have conscripted one particular version of antiquity to underpin their own view of male power, patriarchy, white supremacy, you name it. And I've sort of been in the middle of this, witnessed it myself. Now, I'm going to tell you my own anecdote about coming into contact with this kind of thing very directly. Several years ago on Twitter, I came to the support of the BBC, who had sponsored a cartoon history of Roman Britain for young school kids. We're talking 10, 11-year-olds here. Here's part of it. All right, you can see what the problem is. In one part of this cartoon history, they pictured an elite Roman family in the province of Britain. It was probably, not quite clear, probably meant to be the governor's family, who were clearly not all of them white. There was a huge Twitter and other social media pile-in against the BBC for pushing a crude multicultural agenda. You know the kind of thing. This was actually before the word woke was invented. It would now be, how woke is that? We didn't say woke back then. It was much more, this is multiculturalism gone mad, And after watching some of the abuse that this programme had got, I eventually intervened to say that what was shown was not impossible. One Roman governor of Roman Britain in the 2nd century AD, and I think the BBC had him in mind, was a man called Quintus Lollius Urbicus, who came from Tidis in modern Algeria. And there's his lovely tomb, actually. Now, we do not know his ethnicity. We have no idea. We do not know what he looked like. But there is a chance, and I don't know how big a chance, there's a chance that he was not white and that he had some sub-Saharan ancestry. We will never know. If you say that on Twitter, even to the extent of saying, not that this was right, but this might possibly have been right, you get slaughtered, I can tell you. You get parodied, and people put in a huge huge amount of time to making you look an idiot. There were a whole series of spoof book covers which people had invented and then tweeted, which said, you know, the real Elizabeth I by Mary Beard, the real Shakespeare by Mary Beard. And they went through enormous numbers of, you know, famous people from British history and did that to them, right? Occasionally they made them into a TV program, watch on BBC Two, and you can see, you know, the Viking invasion, and the Viking invasion was full of black people. I think what is clear, that there are many people in the United Kingdom who think that there were no people of colour in the UK until the 1950s. They're wrong, but that is a version of how they have constructed their history. But more than that, they see the Roman period as a period of pure whiteness, and so also as a bastion against historical diversity, and so also against present modern diversity. And I have no doubt that there is a version of white classics embedded in that. And I think we do have to think how to address that question. And I shall be coming back to that briefly too. If you want more examples of this, not just in terms of race, but also plenty of misogyny too, I think Donna Zuckerberg's book, Not All Dead White Men, will give you more than you could possibly need. Although it's often from a very American perspective. Now, I also recognise that, as critics of the subject say, much of the public-facing work of classical scholarship has invested in the admiration of, rather than the critical engagement with, the ancient world. There has been a sense that publicly at least, we put or should put Greco-Roman antiquity on a bit of a pedestal, as if it were a model for us, which it sure isn't. And there's been far too much talk, I think, of things like the Greek miracle, right? The noble origins of democracy in Athens, or art, or theatre, and so on. And there's been far too little talk in our public face of the classics. There's been far too little talk about what the idea of the Greek miracle is actually concealing. Now, I think there is a real difficulty here, and I would be the first to admit that going to a wide audience and saying that you want to get people interested in a group of cultures that were exploitative, imperialist, violent, misogynist, and slave-owning, in those terms is rather difficult to pull off, right? But there are other ways of thinking about and other ways of presenting the ancient world to a wider audience, which don't invest solely in the praise of that world. And I think, to make a very basic point, but it's one that I think needs making, in the end, it is very important that we're interested in cultures that don't simply conform to our own ideas of what's good and bad. So, in all kinds of ways, I'm with some of these critiques of the subject. My problem, though, is how this new generation of critics of classics, even if I think they're often right to be critical, is how they've gone much further than what I think is a reasonable critique in presenting, and I think misrepresenting, the history of the subject as an explanation of its failure. The idea that, of course, classics is failing because look how it is practiced. And indeed, I think there are, as I say, some really serious misrepresentations of the ancient world, its traditions, and its reception going on. To put this briefly and a bit too crudely, there's a growing modern orthodoxy within the profession that now sees classics as behind, underlying, some ways even responsible for, the dictatorships of the mid-20th century, the European imperialism of the previous 200 years, modelled on the Roman Empire, and the elevation of whiteness as the touchstone of beauty, not to mention legitimating misogyny, rape, and violence against women. Now, some of that may be true, and some of it, I think, in part is true. But it is only true in any general sense if you ignore other impacts of classics in the last several hundred years. The undermining, for example, of the narrow clericalism of some parts of the Catholic Church, the underpinning of different non-heterosexual versions of sexuality in the 19th century, the radical revolutionary Marxism of Karl Marx, whose PhD thesis, let's not forget, was on the Greek philosopher Epicurus, or, for that matter, the work of Sigmund Freud passing. Now, when I said something along those lines at a meeting of the Society of Classical Studies in the USA a few years ago, I was heavily criticised. Among other things, I had said that classics as a discipline went in many different ways, and that it did not have a politics. Classics did not have a politics. That it may become politicized, but it had no politics. Now, quite a lot of people in the US said, how bloody naive is that? You know, poor old lady, doesn't she realize that classics is political? You know. Now, my answer to that is, of course, I realize that. All academic subjects are political, but they are not intrinsically political. It's us who gives them the politics, right? They don't have it, you know, intrinsically. They're politicized or they're made political. They don't come with their politics written into them. You might say similarly that it's not the fault of nuclear physics as a subject that some nuclear physicists made an atomic bomb, right? That wasn't written into nuclear physics. And in some ways, I thought it was a terrible misunderstanding of what I'd said. On the other hand, there is a basic rule, I think, that if people misunderstand what you say, that might be because you hadn't explained it very well. So what I want to do now is to have a better look at the complexity of the politics of classics over the last couple of hundred years by using what might seem a very simple and obvious example, which is the relationship of classics to the politics of, in particular, but you could widen this, the politics of, in particular, the British Empire. So I'm going to take one example before coming back to think what we might do now and whether we remain optimistic. So what I want to do in thinking about imperialism is try to highlight the complexities and the disagreements within the politics of empire, particularly in the UK in the 19th century, that simply get written out of the modern recent attempts, to pin imperialism onto classics as one of its crimes. Okay. The standard argument, which I'm sure you know well, goes that the British Empire and its destructive imperialist mission was encouraged and legitimated by the Roman Empire, eagerly embraced by men in the UK who had been brought up on an elite school curriculum of Latin and Roman history. Now, that intersection is nicely summed up in this 1950s cartoon of one of the most famous classicists of the British 19th century, Benjamin Hall Kennedy. Kennedy, who was author of, among other things, our British most famous Latin grammar book, is here depicted as dressed up in the stereotypical kit of an imperial explorer or predator, leading a strange animal out of the jungle. And the caption is, "Kennedy discovers the gerund and leads it back into captivity." It was in part a joke at the expense of the study-bound professor who'd never been near a jungle in his life. But it was also a reminder that mastering Latin grammar, and the gerund here is standing, I suppose, for the most difficult bit, people think, of Latin grammar. Mastering Latin grammar was what guaranteed a boy, and I mean boy, a place in the hierarchy of empire, that there is a connection between imperialism and Latin, as practiced by Kennedy. And that's a theme that appears repeated time and again in British culture. The British Foreign Office is decorated with statues of Brits in Roman dress, as if British imperial expansion was ultimately a Roman vision. One of the most notable archaeologists of Roman Britain in the 19th century pointedly compared the Roman general Agricola's campaigns in Britain to the British campaigns in the Crimea. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister was too busy to study the antiquities, he laments, when thinking about the terrible disasters that Britain had experienced in the Crimea. If only the Prime Minister had read more Latin, he would have been more successful. And in Oxford, another 19th century classicist, Benjamin Jowett, on the left there, was notoriously thundering in his insistence that the only people who were capable of governing the British Empire, particularly the Indian Empire, were classicists, preferably those he had trained in Oxford, right? Now, it would be foolish, not to say completely wrong, to deny some connections. There are connections between the ancient world and British imperialism. Classics was integral in the education of the British elite, and that shared classical cultural property offered a way of talking about and processing debates about empire and imperial history. And it wasn't just Roman parallels. British military failures, and we tend to forget that there were a lot of them, could be compared, for example, to the Athenians' mid-5th century BC defeat in Sicily, as discussed and described in Thucydides' history. And in some cases, perhaps many cases, and for some people, and perhaps many people, the Roman Empire in particular did provide some kind of way of justifying the British Empire. That is certainly the case, but it is only one side of the story, which is, of course, much more complicated, much more nuanced, and actually more interesting. For a start, classics provided a legitimacy for the opponents of empire as well as for the supporters. In the late 19th century, the most prominent and powerful anti-imperialist newspaper in Britain was the Manchester Guardian, which for many years was edited by C.P. Scott, who you see in unlikely combination with Jowett here, who had also, of course, been an Oxford classicist. And while Jowett was thundering about classicists being the only suitable people to run the empire, C.P. Scott was trying to attract the very same students to come to his newspaper to attack the empire. Scott's version of the Roman Empire, of course, was Tacitus's version. The slogan of the Scott side of this argument, I'm going to wait until it's lovely. The slogan of the Scott side of the argument was, of course, Tacitus's famous phrase that he puts in the mouth of the Britons in Britain. What do the Romans do in a province? They make a desert and they call it peace. Solitudinem faciunt pacem appellant. And I think, interestingly, it has proved all too easy for modern scholars to forget, and Scott did not forget this, that some of the most powerful criticisms of empire come from Roman writers themselves, that it was a main strand in Roman political thinking, that it was the expansion of empire that caused Roman moral decline. That strand, as so often in these stories of power and exploitation, went side by side with the Romans' aspiration to world conquest. They wanted both world conquest and a sense that empire was what was causing, back from the 2nd century BC, for heaven's sake, Roman decline. Now, part of the problem in dealing with this kind of 19th century evidence is that modern critics of classics and the classical tradition have, I fear, more often raided the history of British imperialism for sound bites to suit their argument than engaged with the complicated rhetoric of the discursive debates. And I think Jowett here provides a clear example. You can, it is true, find plenty of cases where the man is insisting very unpleasantly and vociferously that Greek and Latin are the finest qualifications for administering, in particular, the Indian Empire. It's really over-the-top stuff. But we mustn't forget that that's only one side of the argument. It was part of a debate in which other people were arguing precisely the reverse, that classics was not a good training for imperial government. Indeed, part of the reason that Jowett had to shout so loudly is that there were people who thought the exact opposite. But we tend not to hear about them. Their words do not get extracted and used as part of the case against classics. And it's also the case that some of the key quotations that crop up time and again in discussions of how the British depended on Rome to legitimate their empire are really not quite what they seem. Now, the words I just briefly cited about the usefulness of Roman archaeology in the Crimean War are often wheeled out, and you can see here a bit more of it. Unfortunately, the British are not doing well in the war. Unfortunately, however, the Prime Minister of that day was too busy to study antiquities. It was not until after our army had suffered the severest calamities that a road was made from Balaclava to the camp. Again, we should probably after this have taken him to some of our Roman stations on Hadrian's Wall and shown him the care with which a Roman army was entrenched when it rested even for a night. So the poor old Prime Minister should have been taken on a Roman trip around Hadrian's Wall in order to do better in the Crimean War. In one recent book, and I've again put this quote underneath, this is said to be an explicit argument for the direct significance of Roman military planning to the organization following the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War. Now, let me tell you, this article is absolutely nothing of the sort. If you actually go and look up the original context, and I think very few people do, you will find that it is not part of a practical political argument about empire at all. It is part of a satire entitled "The Practical Advantages Accruing from the Study of Archaeology," in which this is one part, But the author also spends a lot of his time saying how much better Roman kitchen equipment was than the modern equivalent, and how much better Roman underfloor heating was than 19th century coal fires. He has a wonderful picture of how he took the butler of the Duke of somewhere or other to see some of these Roman antiquities, just in the same way as the Prime Minister ought to have gone. And he showed him this great sieve, and he said, "I've got nothing as good as that in my kitchen," right? Says the butler of the Duke of somewhere. It is, in other words, a joke. Now, in saying this, I'm not for a minute trying to defend British imperialism, and I'm not for a minute saying that the Roman Empire had nothing to do with the discussion of the British Empire in the 19th century. Of course it has, and the fact that this extract comes from what is a satiric joke still embeds Rome in the way that you might be thinking about these issues. But my point is that the history of Rome, or classical studies in general, were not simply legitimators or upholders of British imperialism. The relationship between modern Britain and ancient Rome was constantly contested and argued about. Obviously so. It was obviously contested and argued about. One point of difficulty for those who wanted to align the two was that 2,000 years earlier, the territorial extent of the Roman Empire was completely different from the territorial extent of the British Empire. And they worried about this a lot. Brits in the late 19th century reflected rather ruefully that the only overlap between the British and the Roman Empire was 3 small islands, Gibraltar, Malta, and Cyprus, and of course, Britain itself, right? Which was never central to the Roman Empire at all. The paradox for them, in other words, was that the furthest outlying province of the old Roman Empire had become the metropolitan heartland of the new. Things had been completely inverted. So how could you align Rome and the British Empire? And should you? Is that the right thing to do? Now, one answer to that question was found in this famous early 20th century statue of Boudicca, the British rebel against the Romans in the reign of Nero. Now stands rather appropriately outside the Parliament building in London. And what you can see there is a wonderfully kind of Celtic Boudicca. You know, her hair is flying, she's got a chariot with scythes coming out of its wheels. And she is a symbol of female native resistance that I can tell you would not have appealed at all to most early 20th century British patriarchs and members of Parliament who looked at it all the time. However, on the side of the base of the statue was inscribed a couple of lines of poetry. "Regions Caesar never knew, thy posterity shall sway." To paraphrase that, it's saying, don't worry, Boudicca, you lost, but you will win in the end because your descendants will conquer territories that the Romans didn't even know about. Right? So here you've got a complex set of connections in which the anti-Roman rebel, the enemy of Rome, becomes the ancestor of British imperial power. In a complicated set of claims that I think show how impossible for some it was to equate Rome and Britain. And this statue always asks the question, whose side are you on here? Are we on Boudicca's side or are we on the Roman side? Now, my message is that it's all more complicated than we tend to imagine. I'm objecting to the oversimplification of the subject, which turns classics into an enemy that needs to be burned down. There are plenty of ways to critique classics, and I think many of us critique it loudly. That's different. And you see this kind of oversimplification in many other areas of contemporary debates about classics. I think here in particular of current discussions about the colour of ancient sculpture. It is absolutely clear that much ancient sculpture was painted, probably quite brightly, and that the fictional whiteness of ancient sculpture has been conscripted now into a particularly white and hard right version of sculpture and culture. But who's ultimately to blame for that? Well, the standard answer has become it's poor old J.J. Winkelmann, who certainly did enthuse about the luscious white purity of classical sculpture. But he sure didn't invent the luscious white purity of classical sculpture, as he is often credited with doing. Go and look at Michelangelo's David. It was never painted, right? So you can take many of the, I think, areas of current critiques and see the complexities that get missed out. So where does this leave us? Well, I think some of the basic reasons that seemed to me a decade ago to embed classics in our contemporary discussions and to justify them remain broadly the same. The classical world is part of the way we've learnt to talk with and about ourselves. And although I want to resist the idea that classics was a simple legitimator or driver of British or anybody's imperialism, I do want to say that in order to understand that imperialism, which we do need to understand, we have to see how they are talking about classics in coming to discuss their own debates about imperialism. If you take the classics just out of it, you're left with an empty debate. So we need, if we want to understand British imperialism, we do need to think about how they thought about the Romans and what we think. But to come back to what I said at the very beginning and to finish off, there are two particular questions about the future. First, how do we encourage more people and more diverse people into the subject? And how do we challenge the ways that the modern far right has exploited the classical past? Now, my answer to both those questions comes down to different senses of ownership of the subject. On the first question about diversity, I think we have to think very carefully. One powerful recent argument is that if we expanded the geographical and ethnic range of classics as a subject, incorporating, as I said, the ancient world beyond the Greco-Roman Mediterranean heartlands, that would make those who saw their own origins as not white more ready to engage with the subject. Why this argument goes, would people want to study classics if they can't see themselves in that subject? Should we not expand the range so that ancient North Africa, Egypt, the so-called Middle East are much more central to the idea of what classics is? Now, there are a lot of answers to that question, including the response that some Egyptologists give, that they don't propose to give up part of their own area of expertise because classics has got a recruitment problem, right? There is a sense of, the awful kind of territorial imperialism of classics as a discipline. Now, let's do Egypt and Syria, right? Actually, guys, there are people already doing Egypt and Syria, right? But my main answer would be that we ought, perhaps, rather, to celebrate classics as a subject where no one should imagine that they can see or find themselves. In other words, I want to turn that argument on its head. Now, there is, of course, a long tradition in the study of the classical world where people have claimed to do exactly that, right? To see themselves in the Romans. That, in my view, has always been part of the problem, right? Because the truth is, however we adjudicate the debates about the British Empire, the British were not the descendants of the Romans, any more than the modern Greeks, more controversial, are not the descendants of Pericles. And in a sense, I would say that the strength of classics as a subject though not a strength that's always recognised, is that it doesn't belong to anyone. Nobody can see themselves in the ancient world, and everybody is welcome, therefore, in it. Perhaps you might put it in modern terms, classics can act as a safe space in which we have a different kind of freedom to discuss questions of exploitation, inequality, race, empire, outside anybody's ownership. Everybody is welcome. What then, to finish, do we do about the hard right? Right, you can see there Mr. Trump as a Spartan, right? I've mentioned briefly that there's no doubt that some extreme right-wing groups have used and often misused or reinvented aspects of the classical past to justify their own political ideology. What do we do about that? Now, there is quite a lot of understandable outrage within the classical profession. Outrage because to see what you study being used to promote some often vile ideas, actually, well, that hurts a bit. But what can we do beyond outrage? I'm afraid I think the answer is that all we can do is challenge and engage and talk to these people. We can explain why their view of the subject of classics is not always, often is not, our view, and we can have a dialogue with them. Because I think it's absolutely fundamental to say that professional classicists do not own the subject. And there is, in fact, an awkward paradox in saying that classics, in whatever form, redefined or not, is a subject that should have and does have widespread engagement outside the professional community, while at the same time saying, from the professional community itself, you can only engage with this subject if you do it on my terms, right? I think we've got to let these awful people say what they want and challenge them. Otherwise, we're falling back on the same old elitist line that we know and you don't. Now, if I'm optimistic, I think that in the course of my own conflicts about the family of colour in Roman Britain, I think that there were some people, not necessarily the most vocal on Twitter, there were some people who, seeing that argument going on pretty publicly and then in the newspapers, did stop to think about ethnic and racial diversity in Roman Britain. It didn't necessarily change people's minds, but it opened up a debate which people could join. And I'm afraid that I think all you can do is stick in there with that debate and go on challenging them. You can't deny their right to misuse what we don't actually own. But at that point, I'd like to know what some of you think. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sure there are people who have thoughts.
There better be, because I've come a very long way if nobody's got any thoughts.
I have a more general question about the embeddedness of this argument. You can tell I come from the United States. I taught for a number of years at small liberal arts colleges where classics was, of course, part of the curriculum. And in those colleges, over the years, the whole humanities project started to become questioned because other things were taking a larger role, let's say more professional schools in our institutions, more of an orientation towards the marketplace, towards training people. The whole university project as it were, which is very much a 19th century construction, very much based on these ideas of the classics as well, was coming under question. And so I was wondering what you thought about this argument, which I think is a wonderful argument that you're making, but it's within that wider institutional and disciplinary context.
I think that one of the reasons that this has become so inflammatory in the States is precisely that, because the sense that there was a great books canon, explicitly so-called. And I think that also there's been less of a commitment to share. Okay, I know the founding fathers were built in Roman tradition, but I mentioned Hansen and Heath's Who Killed Homer. Now, they are, Hansen, I don't know about Heath, Hansen is pretty right-wing, but reading that commentary in 1998, although I disagreed with them fundamentally on their view of theory, that saying, oh God, you just got interested in theoretical stuff and you won't go out. There was a sense in which professional classicists in the United States have turned away from the public sphere. Now, they say that they're not invited in it. And I not having taught there for more than a few months at a time, I'm probably not the best to analyze this. But I think that we've got to be a bit bolder. I mean, if we want to understand some of the big things that we need to understand, we don't do it just through science. I mean, I think, one classic example, which I thought was very important during COVID, was rightly, huge amounts of money and resources went into developing a vaccine. I'm not remotely thinking that it would have been better if you'd all gone and read Homer instead of developed a vaccine. I'm not saying that. But one of the things that people needed was you had to think about what plague and pandemic meant. You could only face pandemic if you were vaccinated, but you'd also got your head around it. And if you said to people, let's go back to the Iliad, let's go back to the earliest work of Western literature. Do you know how the Iliad starts? Most people would say, no. It starts with a plague, right? Western literature starts with pandemic. And you can go on to, Oedipus the King, whatever. And I think we're just not bold enough about saying that for a culture to face the things it needs to face, it needs to face them through the humanities as well as through scientific solutions, and that would be true of climate change. Now, I also think there's probably quite a lot of appalling self-satisfaction in the great books programs. That great books programs mean, great Western books and this whole construct of Western civilization against the rest, which you can find already in Herodotus if you want, has not been good for the discipline. We've been the victims of that. But I think really we just got to shout a bit louder. Probably. If only it was that easy. I know it's not that easy, but, in part, that's what you've got to do. And stop getting so these right-wing people, they're just awful. But most of them, and some of them are really, truly nasty, and some of them go out in the United States with guns, right? And they're dangerous. There's no doubt about that. And I think it's slightly different in the UK. There's still some dangers. Some of them are just stupid, right? And the more we saw that some of them were just stupid, I think the better. I remember giving a seminar, and it was about how women should present themselves and, women's public face within the university. And once it was in the English faculty in Cambridge, and one student said, "What would I do if I was giving a seminar and someone from the alt-right walked in?" And I thought, they're not going to. They're too terrified. They can't, actually, you're well protected. You're a graduate student. You are not going to get ambushed by someone from the alt-right. So this is being 67, you can say that. It doesn't seem the same when you're 27, I know. Sorry. Shut up, beard.
Further questions?
Surely somebody has. I'm going to be really disappointed if I say there's only one question.
First of all, many, many thanks for this wonderful paper. It was really a great pleasure to listen to you. And then I think that one point is always that antiquity is sort of homogenized in a way that it should never be, because there are so many antiquities. I would also say, if you look at late antiquity, we have, of course, this kind of Caesaropapism in Byzantine tradition, which now is a problem in Russia, for instance.
Yeah.
This is also antiquity.
Right. No, that's right.
It's another antiquity that is very, very dangerous at the moment, for instance.
Yeah.
And of course, this abuse of this tradition is always taking one side of this rich picture of antiquity. And where I would probably disagree with you when you say that no one should see himself or herself in antiquity, because I would see the antiquity as a very, very large picture of the human existence in a way, like a laboratory of what we are living in many different facets. And therefore you can always make use and abuse. And if you look at the whole of the ancient tradition, then you're forced to see it in a multicultural way, sort of in a nuanced way, because you find everything, never an idealized world, because as I used to say always, the Athenians, which we admire for some kind of democracy and other things, but then what did they do? They had their own Srebrenica, of course, in the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, of course, I agree with you, And I remember I was taught by Moses Finley, and whenever anybody said, well, did the Greeks think? Right, he'd say, which Greeks, when? Right? You thought, oh, right. For me, though, I suppose, and I think there might be a gender issue here. I mean, the two things have always been really great for me about the ancient world and studying it. One is you never had to speak Latin and Greek. You didn't have to ask for a pizza in Latin, all that kind of thing. It's always really put me off modern languages. But, which is the quickest way to the Bahnhof, oh God. But also, I feel I can't see myself. I mean, part of the reason, I suppose, that I construct the not being able to find yourself in antiquity as a virtue is because it looks different for women. I could flirt with being Sappho or Livia, but it's, you don't get, there's not much mileage in that. Whereas, I think for men there is a clearer way of seeing a place for themselves. And, I think as always, really, that women in the academy in general are both disadvantaged by their marginalization and in some ways advantaged by it. So in part, I feel that not having to find myself there frees me up hugely. Though I think rightly you can, I could turn that argument on its head. But it is, the homogeneity is quite extraordinary. It's like, teaching students about early Christianity, and you say, well, we've got the Christians on one side and the Romans on the other, and you say the Christians were Romans, right? There was Christian Romans and not Christian Romans, but we've kind of pulled apart antiquity, pagan antiquity, so it sort of excludes things. And that of course, is where the disciplinary divisions of the 19th century both constrain us and open things up. And the reason why Roman Egypt is not generally taught as a classical discipline is because the 19th century disciplinary divisions which made these subjects put Egypt on the other side of the line, just as it put religion on the other side of the line. And partly you want to get rid of those disciplinary divisions, but you also sort of need some, right? We can't, I'm not sure I like the idea. I know there are lots of people, I know it's very fashionable, but global history? Does that mean, how can you know global history? You can't. I don't think. Sorry. Yes.
Umar?
Yeah, thank you very much, also from my side, for your talk. I hope that's all right. I might have several questions. I'd start with the first one. Regarding the role of classics and its situation within the humanities, what do you think about classics acting as a sort of controlling discipline also in terms of methodology for other humanitarian or other fields in the humanities focusing more on the recent past or in contemporary times? So to just pick an example from your talk on the question of ethnicity and whiteness, I would argue that, from an ancient historian's perspective, that for the ancient world, that category doesn't really make sense.
No.
And it exposes that as something contingent, dependent on the intellectual trajectory of the modern West.
Yeah.
And that's actually a helpful notion, because it takes the essence out of it.
Yeah.
Or take the notion of religion, which doesn't really work for a pre-Christian world, but that helps explain the differences in modern Judaism and Islam compared to Protestant Christianity, for example. I think that's quite fruitful and something unique about classics.
Yes. I think the racial aspect is quite difficult, but in general, I'm absolutely with you, because I think that I think this is what you're saying. I would say, look, looking at the ancient world enables us to see the strangeness in our own, and enables us to see the contingencies in the way we divide up the world. And you can do that in all kinds of ways, but religion would be, what is it to have something which is clearly called religion, but which doesn't demand the same kinds of basic building blocks that we think religion demands? Does that make a difference to how we look at religion? And I think that's one of the reasons why classics is so mind-opening, because it's so different. It's both the same and different, and therefore it prizes apart some of the things that we take for granted that we shouldn't take for granted. I think race has proved a really difficult one, because I'm sure you could argue two ways. You could say, look, you could do the before colour prejudice line. You could say, look, what is absolutely crucial about the ancient world is that the kind of the power hierarchy of race just doesn't exist. And I think that's true, in a way. I think that's true. Though you can find some pictures of black slaves which look hell of a lot like it does. And that's one of the reasons why there's been such a lot of work, I think, lately ever since Snowden and co. We can't even quite decide whether there was that racial aspect to ancient culture. I could argue two ways. But in general, I absolutely agree with you. When, in all kinds of ways. What do you say about a culture? How does a culture which does not imagine that punishment is exacted by removal of liberty? How do we think of a culture that doesn't have prisons? And as soon as you ask a student that, the floodgates open actually about our own penal system. So I think I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, thank you. That puts me up to a good start. If that's right, I'd go with the second one. We just finished with the possible political implications of work in the field. And I think in many ways that bears witness to the power of tradition, or the power of a traditional argument that still remains in our society. It's much weaker than it was a century ago, but it's still there. Isn't it, in a way, then also the obligation of a scholar in that field to actually take a side? Not in terms of academic contributions, but in outreach to the society. Because, you can draw the conclusion from antiquity that might is right, or that building a democratic republic with equal justice under law is a good learning from the classics. And silence is in a way affirmation of the status quo then, isn't it?
I'm very happy to take a side. And I'm very happy to tell these idiots that they're wrong. I suppose I have to stand up for their right to speak. And I think where I feel anxious is not about people who want to say, look, the Spartans weren't like that. Let's think about what Spartan culture was about. What does the Apollo Belvedere stand for? I feel very anxious about the side of classics, modern classics, and its critical side, which wants to deny these people a voice. Because I think then we're back. That's what kills it. And I want to tell them. I would like to persuade them that they're wrong. Now, maybe that's just as controlling in a way, as it's just a sort of softer version of saying I want to shut them up. I can say I want to persuade them they're wrong, and it sounds nicer, but maybe it is as manipulative. But I can't bear the excessive professionalization because it'll kill the subject. I don't know, actually.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more.
The future. Talk about the future of classics and about classics, which was the key term throughout the whole thing. I was thinking the way we label disciplines is also interesting. Yeah. Here you are invited by something called Zentrum der Altertumswissenschaften. Yeah. I would not claim that this is a better label than classics. Right. On the other hand, when we talk about classics and about the classics, we seem to evoke a canon of excellence. Yeah? A hierarchy, what is classical and what is not classical. And in this sense, I would say a model to be emulated. Yes. So my question is, how do you feel about the term classics itself? And do you think that this sort of connotations have played a role in the whole history that you've told us?
I know exactly what you mean. And in a way, the subject that I'm talking about probably only exists in England. In the particular way it's been defined. Classics, in the way I have studied it and taught it all my life, was actually invented in Cambridge in about 1870, which put together the particular group of subjects which then became classics. You don't even find that in the United States, although it's closer. You certainly don't find it in most of Europe. And something like, it's not Altertumswissenschaft actually, it's sort of different. And it's probably much more loaded because of the term, which again is a term that really only gets going in the 19th century, which relates to class and hierarchy, etc., etc. I sort of sympathise with people in the UK who feel lumbered with that, feel burdened by the term classics. I want to say we're not going to be a faculty of classics, we're going to be a faculty of ancient world studies, right? And I think I see where they're coming from. I suppose I want to. I've enjoyed being a classicist. I've enjoyed being able to call myself that. And when you get on a train and people say, "What do you study?" and you say classics, and they think that what you mean is Jane Austen, it's kind of. I think it's quite nice. So it's provided me a space to play, and it's provided the coordinates that have enabled me to do some intellectual things that outside that tradition I wouldn't have been able to do so easily. I'd have been able to do other things, but not exactly what I've done. I mean, the place apart from the States where I work most is France, and I just know, I know that it takes you forever if you go to a French university to be able to get the Roman art books next to the literature. It's almost impossible, but you can put other things together. So I personally think I'd rather just flaunt it and put two fingers up and say, yeah, okay, there is a hierarchy here, but it's one that I can deal with, and in fact gives me something to fight against. And it also gives me a good way out on a train. But it's lots of look at the various ways, aren't there? But what used to be called the American Philological Association has now turned itself the Society for Classical Studies. So they're kind of, and we know that classical philology is not the same as classics, as I call it. And I think it's partly fun that, and it's like Oriental studies, isn't it? How many places still teach Oriental studies? Chicago. Yeah, right. We do. Oh God, it's got some funny acronym. FAME. Can't say the Far East either. FAMES. It must be Middle Eastern. So yeah, you teach Oriental studies. Wow. The Oriental Institute in Oxford is just gone. I would keep it and say, we'll fight back with this word. We won't leave this word. No, don't let the bullies use this word. We'll make this word okay.
I had a question to how you think the more modern media around the classics, from books like you mentioned, The Secret History, to movies, and even more recent TikTok aesthetics, affects the future of classics.
I think it helps the future of classics. I mean, I'm very surprised that Madeline Miller's Circe, etc., has been such an extraordinary success on TikTok. I think the books are good, but I'm still surprised that TikTok has embraced her in quite the way it has. I think that I was brought up with I Claudius, Robert Graves' I Claudius, and it's formed my view in part of the ancient world. I cannot see Augustus apart from actually as it was done on the BBC television series of I Claudius, his dying face, and it's imprinted. But it's a bit like the terminology. I think that it adds to the richness and it draws people in, and I think it's really great. And it's another reason why you're going to say, look, this is still part of the conversation. Whether, we've got nasty ones on the screen, but we've also got people retelling Greek mythology from a radically feminist perspective. All that is going on at the same time, and I think it'd be worrying if it weren't. If we were a subject rooted in myth that nobody was interested in, and the other side of that would be, and the unpleasant side, is the way the figure of the head of Medusa is still so strongly resonant, and that I was shocked when I saw some of the Trump memorabilia from the Clinton versus Trump electoral campaign, and it had Trump holding, as Perseus, holding up a Gorgon head with the features of Clinton. And I thought, God, and what was interesting there, and I suppose it's going on in these pictures too, and to some extent in the novels, is that I'm sure that most people who bought these Trump memorabilias couldn't tell you what the story of Perseus and Medusa was. But somehow they knew. There's a kind of way in which these mythemes, in a sense, are things that we share still. And they're things that you can do things with. And I think one of the best is Margaret Atwood's Penelopead, which very briefly tells the Odyssey from the girl's point of view and the women who are killed at the end. So I think it's all great. Some of them are better than others, but then that's always the way.
Yes, you finished before with saying, if I'm optimist. And I just wanted to ask you, have you noticed any positive changes in the way the subject is taught? Or do these movements, these pictures actually signal negative change?
Yeah. The subject has been revolutionized in my career. It is unrecognizable. Now, I don't know how far that you can transfer that to other universities, but I was brought up as a student with largely linguistic, very strong classical canon of works that were studied. And certainly there was nothing about women. We used to do women occasionally in the summer term before the exams, and that was because they weren't important. It's what you do at the end of the year. And now the range of reading that the students in Cambridge do, we didn't do Greek imperial literature. We didn't read Lucian or Plutarch, really, unless you were doing Roman history. And so the range has expanded, and the questions are just, utterly different. And that's why I suppose I think it's part of what gives me an optimism, because actually, it isn't a question of, on the one hand, are these guys who are, shoving up pictures of the Apollo Belvedere and saying, Europa Nostra, versus a load of professional classicists who are not changing and are, just sitting in the library and reading the same texts. There's a subject which, when it's done well, has transformed itself and goes on transforming itself in terms of what it studies and how, I think. So I think that's part of my optimism. Even though, people will say, look, what do you study? What are those people that oh God, they're doing all this stuff about women and race and antiquity. And, in my day, we used to read Thucydides. Well, we still read Thucydides, don't we? But we read him in a different way. And it's a broad church, and I'm very, I'm actually very pleased that there are some people who spend 20 years in the library reading 5 lines of Euripides. You know, it's often really useful. It's just as long as everybody's not doing that. I think that's the point. You know, we don't want everybody being like me.
I think we have one last question.
Well, it's by no means as sophisticated as all the other questions so far, but still, I'm curious to hear your advice. It's got a bit to. It doesn't have to do with any of the topics we were discussing now, but it also has to do with classics and the future of it. That whenever, like, I don't know, at a party or wherever, when people ask me what I study, and then I answer, well, Latin philology, then 99% of the time the follow-up question is, what do you do with it?
Yeah.
And I don't know, it seems it resonates with some people. And yeah, I'm just curious to hear your advice, because they don't ask that because of, look what classics have done. They bought Hitler, they brought Trump, whatever. It's more that economic sentiment of there's no point in doing that for the market, or you should do law or politics or computer science.
I'm going to give you an answer which is inevitably drawn from my own experience, and I don't know how it would fit with other countries' employment, relations of employment to universities, etc. I've thought about that a lot recently, because as I was about to retire, I had quite a lot of contact with old students I hadn't seen for ages. We had dinners and parties and things. And we were trying to get them partly to give money to classics, the richer ones, but also to engage with it. And it was a real eye-opener. They were often students, ex-students in their 50s. And they went onto our website and said they were very interested in how we posed just that question. What's the point? What's the point of doing classics? What do you go on to do? And they said quite rightly that if you looked at the Cambridge Classics faculty website, you got the impression that you could either be a teacher, a librarian, or work in a museum. And that was the only options. We all knew there were many more options, but those were the options that somehow were paraded. And these were students who were, financial managers, business people, CEOs of cosmetic companies, a whole range. And they said what they had really enjoyed about classics was that it could take you all kinds of different places. And it was a broad enough set of disciplines, all under one banner, that you got very different sorts of skills that you could redeploy. And they said, but you don't say that. Why don't you say that, here is one of the richest people, sorry, I shouldn't make it sound as if this was therefore good, but let's pretend it is. Here's one of the richest people, and what did they do? They did classics. We then made a few little films and got in touch with some old alums. So we found one of the most famous stand-up comedians on British television had done classics in Cambridge. Amazing. And so he came and he did a bit of our film saying, I did classics. So I think that it sounds extremely old-fashioned, because the tendency was to say, look, if you want to do law, you do law, right? If you want to do something financial, you do economics. And they were saying resist that, because this is what you learn when you learn about the ancient world, and the different standpoints it gives you takes you right into what makes you a success in almost anything. Well, not medicine and brain surgery. I wouldn't want a classicist really, but general outward-facing things. But I think it's the right question, and I think I've always been rather bad at answering. So why do you do it? And I've got some, I've got some pictures in my head of students who've done, truly extraordinary things, utterly different, but still think that it's absolutely essential. So you have to practice an answer in front of a mirror, I think is what you do. So
I wondered whether you were thinking of Boris Johnson when you mentioned the stand-up comedian.
The trouble about Boris is he gives classics a bad name.
I don't want to stop the discussion as long as we have questions from anyone under 30. So we have more questions here. If you are still able to keep on with the discussion,
we need a drink now,
please.
So hi, this might be a naive question, but I was wondering, how would you present an embracing view of history from which we are directly the fruit, to the people who thrown statues down last year or 2 years back during the Black Lives Matter movement? And how do you present an rich and embracing view of history to those kind of people who are convinced that it had an effect on our view now?
I've thought about a lot because there was famous examples in the UK. And I think my position would be very strongly that I think there are some statues I'm very happy to see the back of. And I don't think it's destroying history. Some statues throughout history have always been taken down. The Romans were very good at destroying statues. So I don't think that no statue should ever be taken down. What I do think is, and I think this is a more productive answer to the question, is that I think what got left out in those discussions was a more complicated reading of what statues in public spaces were for. Why do we have statues? And there was a rather simplistic idea that you only show people in public, in the public forum, as it were, who you admire, right? That the statues that we see around us are the good side of history. And I think that is a very narrow way of seeing what statues do and what they're for. And I think that the example that comes to mind, and it's not a very good one for outside the UK, but in Trafalgar Square there are many statues, some of which are contested and some of which aren't. There's one that isn't, is Charles I, the King Charles I, who was the British king, who's completely awful and was part of Britain's really only big civil war and was beheaded. And his statue is in Trafalgar Square, just underneath Nelson's column. And you say, look, why do we have him? He's an absolute bastard. We really don't. In almost every way, he believed in the divine right of kings, and the idea that the monarch was. It was. Anti-democracy doesn't come into it, and it's always seemed to me that we have him there, not to admire him, but to remind ourselves that we killed him. Actually, and to remind ourselves that was necessary and right, but we're guilty. It's about facing up to the past and your implication in it, as much as it is simply admiring these heroes. That said, I'm still quite happy that some of them go, but I think we need to think harder about what the role. It's as wide as you put it, really. What is the, what do we think history is for, and what do we think seeing these figures of history amounts to? And I think that we look at Charles I and we think, I'm jolly glad you didn't win, but also, we've all got his blood on our hands, and that's what, so there are more complicated messages than ever got discussed in the whole statue toppling period.
One very last question.
So my question is more about the research. How can the subject of classics, or wants it to, reflect or address the complex entanglement between the ancient cultures in the Mediterranean? For example, the Ptolemies as an entanglement of Egyptian and Greek history, or the Phoenicians and their role in the Roman culture. So I'm really wondering, how can it reflect it without being exclusively Roman or Greek history? Or does it want to at all?
I think that's really important, and I think it must want to. But it gets very tied up in these disciplinary divisions so different parts of the academy kind of claim the right to have different bits of the world as theirs. Now, I think over my career that has changed, because I think that people, in some ways why disciplinary divisions are good is they not only separate, but they encourage you to break them down. They work in two ways. They say, look, what would happen if we put Egypt back into Rome? Or what would happen if we put the Phoenicians back into into classical Mediterranean history? So they both keep apart and encourage you to break them down. I think, I joked a bit, though, about saying that, Egyptologists don't like the idea much that classicists think that they can come and do Egyptology just because they want to widen their kind of gene pool a bit. And I think it's about collaboration, isn't it, really? I think it's about talking to people, and it's about different things, playing with putting the boundaries in different places, because you always see something different. I suppose it's Egypt that I know best, but it changes your mind about ancient Greece and Rome changes your mind about you, but ancient Egypt changes your mind about ancient Greece and Rome. So the first time I saw the temple reliefs which showed Augustus as a pharaoh, I thought, blimey, you could actually see the Roman emperor differently from the way that I have always conceived of him. So I think it's hugely, hugely productive. But I think it always has to be improvised. You have to break down a particular barrier and see what happens when you shake things up. And I don't think you necessarily need to say the classical world now extends from Nubia to Scotland. It might do. Classicists are terribly imperialist about their subject. They just want to take in more, right? Not always. Sometimes it's good, but it's...
We have a very, very, very last question.
I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you. This might be a bit of an inflammatory question, I'm sorry. But we were talking about these kind of people that we have displayed at the front, the alt-right, and such people that misrepresent, I suppose, what classical literature and history says. And you were saying that we should let them speak and give them a voice, and I don't disagree with that in a sense. On the other hand, I would like to ask if you would give them the same validity as a voice from somebody who has studied this for their whole life?
I think my answer to that is no. Because I think that one of the things that having a voice demands, in order to have your voice listened to, more than on Twitter, is you've got to know something. That having a voice doesn't mean just sounding off, saying anything you want to, without ever having done things. And you see an awful lot of people claiming a voice on Twitter without knowing a thing. And they particularly go for women who do, because they think women who know something can be written off, but men who know something tend to get respected. So it's hard to weigh it up. Why I feel anxious is because I hate the idea that you have a subject which is all around us. Whether it's in the architecture that we're used to seeing, it's on the television, it's on films, it's in the words we use, and then classicists come along and say it's only me that can speak about this. Only if you've done a degree and then a PhD or whatever, only then can you speak. And it's hard to find, it's hard to find the balance. And in the end, I don't speak to everybody on Twitter. I do try, when they say something wrong, I try to say, I don't think you've got that quite right. And I sometimes suggest a reading list. And again, I think it's not, in the case of some of them, I think there are some you're never going to convince. That you say, I'm afraid that the Apollo Belvedere isn't a statue of the 5th century BC. But I think the important thing to realize about a lot of social media is that you're not just talking to them, other people are looking at what you're saying, and that the people who don't contribute might be getting the point, even if they can, the either very nasty or very stupid, or both very nasty and very stupid people who are putting out this rubbish. They might be impervious to your critiques. But I think I don't want to send them underground. I don't want little secret societies where they talk about classics in a way that, that they do only on their own because they're not allowed. They're not allowed onto Twitter because they haven't got a degree in it. But it's a trade-off, and in the end, we've got to say that expertise means something. Sorry, mate, I'm a professor of classics and you ain't. End of, at some point. And so, yes, I agree. It depends along the spectrum where you decide to give up and just say, look, who's the professor around here, me or you?
End of at some point, maybe the right word exactly now. Thank you very much once again for this wonderful talk and also for this wonderful discussion. I said to Mary in the beginning before her paper that probably the students want to ask many questions in the discussion, and I'm so happy that I was wrong and that so many of you participated in the discussion. That's really wonderful. I want to take the occasion to remind you or to give you the hint that on Friday, November 25th, you have the occasion to get to know the ancient world and especially the Zurich Center for the Study of the Ancient World a little bit better at the Abend der offenen Tür. You are all invited to learn more about the ancient world, do some activities. You can bring your kids, your family, your grandparents, whoever you want. And you will also get free drinks and some food, whatever. So you are all invited, and I hope that some of you might find a way again and visit us. Once again, thank you so much for your talk, for this discussion, and we were very pleased to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.